This module is about moving a business continuity plan from documented intent to evidence-based capability. A written plan may describe roles, recovery priorities, communications resources, and decision points, but documentation alone does not prove that those arrangements can work under pressure. The approved thesis for this module is direct. A BCP becomes credible when defined requirements are tested against diagnostic criteria, supported by reliable evidence, and improved through management-dispositioned corrective action. The management outcome is also clear. The organization should be able to show evidence that defined BCP capabilities can work and improve. That is the standard for this discussion. We are not teaching live activation, command execution, tactical communications, recovery sequencing, or return to normal operations here. Those belong outside this module. The focus here is assurance. What was tested, what evidence was collected, what the evidence supports, what remains uncertain, and what management decided to do about any gap. For executives, auditors, assurance teams, BCM practitioners, process owners, and crisis teams, this is the difference between a plan that looks complete and a plan that has defensible evidence behind it. The audience should leave with one practical discipline. Every assurance claim must be traceable. A statement that the BCP can work should be supported by a defined requirement, a defined test, defined criteria, reliable evidence, and an accountable decision on what follows. The first discipline in BCP testing is to avoid overclaiming. No single exercise proves the entire BCP. An exercise provides evidence only for the capabilities, assumptions, participants, conditions, and criteria within its defined scope. If the exercise tested executive activation decision-making under one condition, then the evidence supports only that tested capability under that scoped condition. It does not automatically validate supplier escalation, system restoration, workforce safety constraints, privacy escalation, or other untested parts of the plan. This matters because false confidence is a real assurance failure. A well-run exercise can still leave major capabilities untested. A successful response by one group does not prove success by another group. A scenario with one set of conditions does not prove performance under different conditions. The proper management question is therefore not, did the BCP pass? The proper question is, what evidence do we now have? What does that evidence actually cover? And what remains outside the evidence boundary? This boundary discipline protects the organization from treating a limited exercise as full validation. This is also why the words within scope matter. Scope defines what the exercise was designed to observe. Conditions define the pressure applied. Participants define who was involved. Criteria define what performance meant. Records define what can be relied on afterward. Anything outside those boundaries stays outside the validation claim. Because exercise evidence is bounded, the result should not be reduced to pass, partial, or fail. Those labels create theater because they compress evidence, limitations, and uncertainty into a superficial judgment. This module preserves 5 diagnostic ratings exactly. First, effective. The capability met the objective within defined criteria, and evidence supports reliable performance. Second, effective with limitations. The capability generally worked, but limitations, constraints, or improvement needs were observed. Third, partially effective. The capability achieved some objective elements, but significant gaps remain. Fourth, not effective. The capability did not achieve the defined objective, or the evidence was insufficient to support the capability. Fifth, not tested/not observed. The capability was outside scope, not triggered, or not evidenced. These ratings are useful because each rating tells management something different. Effective supports confidence within scope. Effective with limitations points to constrained, but functioning capability. Partially effective warns that some elements work, but the gap remains serious. Not effective indicates failed or unsupported capability. Not tested slash not observed prevents validation from being implied where evidence does not exist. In practice, these ratings also help management prioritize response. A rating of effective with limitations may require focused improvement but not wholesale redesign. A rating of partially effective may require deeper corrective action or retest. Not tested slash not observed requires future assurance planning rather than optimistic interpretation. The central assurance logic of this module is the complete requirement to evidence chain. It begins with requirements, BIA requirement, then BCP requirement, then capability objective. This means the test must be anchored to what the organization needs to recover, what the plan says must exist, and what specific capability must function. The next layer is test design, exercise slash test scope, scenario or test condition, expected performance criteria, and evidence required. This layer defines what will be tested, under what condition, against what expectation, and what evidence must be available to support a conclusion. The third layer is results, evidence collected, diagnostic rating, finding or observation, and risk implication. Notice that evidence required and evidence collected are separate. Required evidence is what should be available to support judgment. Collected evidence is what was actually obtained. The final layer is disposition and improvement, corrective action or risk acceptance, owner and resources, verification or retest, management disposition, and updated BCP, annex training or control. If any link is missing, assurance weakens. The chain prevents unsupported claims by forcing traceability from the original requirement to the final management decision. Slide 4 should be read from top to bottom. The first layer asks what requirement is being protected. The second layer asks how the test was designed to examine that requirement. The third layer asks what happened and what it means. The final layer asks what management will do, who will own it, and how closure will be verified. Testing should be progressive and risk-based. The baseline sequence moves from document review to role walkthrough to tabletop exercise to functional test to integrated simulation, and finally to actual event evidence review. This is not a decorative maturity ladder. It is a practical way to build assurance in proportion to risk and need. A document review may confirm whether required plan elements exist. A role walkthrough may clarify whether assigned people understand their roles. A tabletop exercise may test decisions and coordination. A functional test may examine whether a specific capability operates as intended. An integrated simulation may test multiple interfaces together. Actual event evidence review may provide strong evidence if reliable records exist. The depth of testing should reflect criticality, risk, major change, past failures, contractual obligation, regulatory expectation, and management assurance need. The important point is proportionality. Not every capability needs the same exercise depth at the same time, but critical capability should not remain indefinitely supported only by assumptions or documents. The program should therefore avoid two extremes. One extreme is a paper-only program that never challenges assumptions. The other is an aggressive simulation that creates activity but weak traceability. A progressive program balances effort, evidence value, risk, and management assurance need. Exercise design should begin with the capability and objective, not with drama. A dramatic scenario may attract attention, but it does not automatically create useful assurance. The minimum design sequence is requirement, capability, objective, scenario condition, inject, criterion, and evidence. The requirement asks what recovery requirement must be protected. The capability asks what must exist and function. The objective asks what question the exercise must answer. The scenario condition places the capability under realistic pressure. The inject introduces a controlled complication. The criterion defines the expected performance, target, tolerance, or standard for judgment. The evidence defines the records, logs, observations, screenshots, timestamps, or forms that will support the conclusion. For example, if the requirement is to activate the BCP within a required decision window, then the capability may be executive continuity decision making. The objective may be to determine whether activation decisions can be made within the required time using assigned authority and alternates. That is a capability question, not a theatrical disaster script. The example in the baseline shows this logic clearly. The requirement is activation within a decision window. The capability is executive continuity decision making. The objective is whether decisions can be made using assigned authority and alternates. The scenario and inject exist to pressure that question, not to entertain participants. Injects are useful only when they challenge assumptions in a controlled and evidence-linked way. An inject is a controlled complication introduced into an exercise to test assumptions, decisions, coordination, dependencies, and recovery logic. The baseline examples are deliberate. A loss of communication challenges the assumption that mobile phones will work and asks what alternative communication path will be used. Supplier failure challenges the assumption that an alternate supplier is available and asks how continuity objectives will be maintained. Unavailable decision authority challenges the assumption that the authorizing executive can be reached and asks whether command succession functions correctly. Delayed system restoration challenges the assumption that backup restoration will meet target and asks what workaround is activated and who authorizes it. Privacy or regulatory escalation challenges the assumption that a cyber incident is operational only. Workforce safety constraint challenges the assumption that employees can report to the alternate site. The principle is critical. Injects should challenge assumptions. They should not embarrass participants. A good inject has a test question, a criterion, and evidence. A weak inject merely creates confusion. A useful inject reveals whether an assumption can survive pressure. It should be controlled, purposeful, and observable. If the exercise team cannot state the criterion and expected evidence for an inject, that inject should be redesigned before use. A useful exercise should have a controlled documentation package before, during, and after the exercise. Before the exercise, the records should include the exercise charter or plan, scope and exclusions, objectives and capabilities to test, scenario summary, inject list or event schedule, participant list and roles, exercise governance roles, safety and control rules, simulated or real communication rules, data privacy and confidentiality controls, evaluation criteria, diagnostic rating guide, and evidence collection plan. During the exercise, the organization should capture attendance, decision logs, inject responses, communication records, observer notes, screenshots, system logs, forms, time records where applicable, deviations, and assumptions. After the exercise, the package should include hot wash notes, the after action report, evidence register, diagnostic ratings, corrective action plan, management disposition, verification or retest plan, and BCP update register. The key message is simple. Evidence is not something to reconstruct after the fact. If there is no evidence plan, assurance becomes weak, selective, and vulnerable to memory bias. The documentation package is therefore not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is the assurance architecture. It protects the integrity of the conclusion by showing what was intended, what occurred, what was observed, what evidence exists, and what action or acceptance was approved afterward. Exercises must be governed and controlled. The baseline identifies governance roles and safety controls because testing should not create unmanaged operational, safety, confidentiality, or communication risk. Governance roles include the executive sponsor, exercise director, controller, or facilitator, evaluators and observers, participants, and support for safety, technical matters, evidence custody, and communications. These roles clarify who sponsors the exercise, who directs it, who controls play, who evaluates, who participates, and who protects safety, evidence, technical continuity, and communication boundaries. The control rules are equally important. Real emergencies override exercise play. Pause or abort criteria must be defined. The exercise must not require unsafe operational actions. It must not cause unauthorized system changes. It must not expose personal or confidential data in an uncontrolled way. It must distinguish simulated communication from real communication. It should also preserve a no-blame learning environment. Governance and safety controls make the exercise credible because they keep the learning activity controlled, observable, and defensible. These controls also support participant confidence. People should know when play is simulated, when a real emergency overrides the exercise, what actions are prohibited, and how sensitive information is protected. That clarity allows the exercise to be serious without becoming unsafe or uncontrolled. The hot wash is the first learning stage after exercise play, but it is not the final assessment. Its purpose is to capture immediate observations while memory is fresh. The useful questions are direct. What worked? What failed? What surprised us? What assumptions were wrong? Which decisions were unclear? Which communication paths worked or failed? What should be improved? These questions collect early insight from participants, evaluators, observers, and controllers. The output is not a formal conclusion by itself. The output is initial observation notes, immediate issues requiring escalation, and candidate strengths and gaps for formal analysis. Treating hot wash notes as the final after-action report is a common mistake because immediate recollection is not the same as evidence analysis. The hot wash is valuable because it preserves fresh observations, but those observations still need to be checked against the exercise objective criteria, evidence collected, limitations, and diagnostic rating model. It is the start of learning, not the end of assurance. For assurance purposes, hot wash output should be treated as raw input. It is valuable because it captures fresh perspective, but it should not be used alone to close findings, validate capability, or conclude that the BCP works. It still needs structured analysis. The after action report, or AAR, is the structured evidence analysis stage. Its purpose is to analyze evidence, results, causes, limitations, strengths, and improvement needs. The AAR should cover exercise objectives, scope and limitations, scenario and inject summary, evidence reviewed, diagnostic ratings, findings, strengths, gaps, risk implications, root or contributing causes, and untested or not observed capabilities. This is where observations become evidence-supported findings. A useful AAR does not merely summarize what happened. It explains what the evidence shows, what criteria were met or not met, what capability worked, what limits were observed, what assumptions failed, and what risk implication follows. It also identifies the capability that was not tested or not observed. That last point matters because an AAR that ignores untested capability can give management false comfort. The AAR is therefore the bridge between exercise play and accountable management action. It converts raw observation into a formal assessment of exercise results and evidence-supported findings. The AAR should also preserve limitations. If evidence was incomplete, say so. If a capability was not triggered, state it. If an observed strength depended on one person, rather than a controlled arrangement, document that limitation. The value of the AAR is disciplined truth, not reputational comfort. The improvement plan is separate from both the hot wash and the AAR. The hot wash captures immediate observations. The AAR analyzes evidence and findings. The improvement plan converts learning into approved action. The required fields are finding, required action owner, resources or funding needed, target date, verification method, retest requirement where applicable, closure criteria, and management disposition. This structure prevents improvement from remaining as informal commentary. A finding without an assigned owner is weak. An action without resources may not be executable. A target date without verification may produce only activity, not assurance. A closure criterion without management disposition may leave the issue unresolved. The closure rule is especially important. A corrective action is not complete merely because a document was updated. Closure requires verification, retest, effectiveness check, or formal risk acceptance. This is the discipline that turns exercise learning into management-controlled improvement. Without this plan, the organization may run exercises but fail to improve capability. The improvement plan is where accountability becomes visible. The findings should be clear, the required action should be specific, the owner should be named, resources should be explicit, and verification should be defined. Otherwise, the exercise produces awareness but not controlled improvement. The treatment of untested capabilities is one of the most important assurance controls in this module. If a capability is outside scope, not triggered, or not evidenced, it must be marked as not tested/not observed. Do not infer validation from adjacent capabilities. If communications escalation worked during an exercise, that does not automatically prove supplier escalation. If executive decision making was observed, that does not automatically prove technical restoration. If one site participated, that does not automatically prove other sites can perform. Untested critical capabilities should be carried into the future exercise program. If a critical capability remains untested, management disposition is required. The disposition may be temporary risk acceptance, scheduled testing, or compensating assurance, depending on what the evidence and governance context support. The point is not to punish teams for scope boundaries. The point is to preserve honest assurance. A capability that was not observed should not be silently promoted into a validated capability. This is especially important for critical capabilities. A capability can be important and still remain untested in a particular exercise. The correct response is not to imply success. The correct response is to mark the evidence gap and decide whether to schedule testing, accept risk temporarily, or require compensating assurance. Actual disruptions can provide stronger evidence than exercises, but only if records are reliable and the event is analyzed before being treated as validation evidence. Acceptable actual event evidence may include activation records, seat rep records, decision logs, communication logs, system recovery logs, manual workaround records, time-stamped restoration evidence, customer, supplier, regulator, or stakeholder correspondence, incident reports, corrective action records, and management review records. However, actual event evidence is still bounded. The event conditions may not match the planned scenario. Evidence may be incomplete because people were managing the disruption, not collecting perfect records. Some actions may have succeeded because of individual heroics rather than controlled capability. Therefore, actual event performance is evidence, but it is not automatic proof of complete capability. Validation authority should also be distinguished. The baseline lists process owner validation, technical owner validation, BCM coordinator validation, management validation, and assurance validation. These are authority distinctions, not invented thresholds. The question remains, who is competent and authorized to validate which part of the evidence? Actual event evidence should therefore be handled with professional caution. Success during a real disruption may be meaningful, but the analysis must ask whether success came from planned capability, improvised effort, individual heroics, or favorable conditions. Only then can the evidence be used responsibly. Management disposition is the final control point. Exercise results, AAR findings, untested capabilities, and actual event evidence must not end as informal observations. They must lead to a clear disposition. The baseline options include corrective action approved and funded, corrective action modified and approved, retest required before closure, temporary risk accepted with expiry or review date, permanent residual risk accepted by proper authority, BCP, BIA, or strategy revision required, or supplier system training or resource change required. Cross-functional topics may be framed as possible exercise objectives where relevant such as privacy breach assessment, regulatory notification, worker safety decision making, crisis communication approval, contractual reporting, supplier escalation, cyber containment and recovery interface, and financial continuity or emergency spending approval. They are not universal obligations in this module. The closing line captures the whole message. The objective is not to pass an exercise. The objective is to create reliable evidence, expose capability gaps while failure is still cheap, and force management disposition on what must improve. The final discipline is management ownership. If the evidence shows a gap, management must decide whether to fund correction, modify action, require retest, accept risk, revise the plan or strategy, or change resources. Without disposition, testing stops at observation rather than assurance. This is why disposition is the endpoint of the module.